Hello, my name is Avery, here in California, whatever. Um, and so I did my research paper, my thesis on examining really why musicians make music the way they, or why they make it in the first place. And this interest of mine came from the form of I've always liked music and stuff like that, and then I was lucky enough to be able to interview certain musicians and publish pieces and stuff like that, and I always went into the interviews really wanting to ask questions that I was naturally curious about and that I wanted to know the answers to. And I found myself after looking over my publication and stuff like that, noticing that I was really trying to get to the question of why does this artist make the music that they do? And that really is, I don't know how much you read musician interviews or whatever, but in my opinion, I think the most interesting part of interviews tend to be where the artist answers that question of why they make music. There's other stuff that comes from like what a day in the life for this person is like, but when they start saying how their mother taught them some music and it made them truly happy and that's why they spend their whole lives and dedicate their lives to it, I think that's the most fulfilling thing in an interview that I'm looking for when I read them. But that's really why I got curious and thought it'd be valuable to create a body of work where we can understand what big famous musicians, why they create the music they do, because it's a really different answer, I think, or has the potential to be a more different answer than somebody in a cafe working at night, whatever, just getting a few bucks. And so the way I decided to narrow this down, because I can't just say all musicians, that'd be a lot and it'd be impossible to answer. But I decided I would narrow it down to famous musicians, and then in the way of defining that, I figured the Rolling Stone Top 20 would be the best way to define that. I looked at other lists like Billboard, and initially I was going to compile the top 20 based on Billboard and Rolling Stone, but Billboard had stuff like Justin Bieber at like number 20, and then it had Nirvana at 90. Things that, like, I don't think anybody in a music shop would agree with stuff like that. But the Rolling Stone one made a lot of sense. It was compiled. They gathered 55 artists slash musicians, producers, label executives, reviewers, stuff like that, and said, what are your top 100? It's actually 100 artists. And so they gave their answers and they gave the reasons why, and they compiled this list of 100. And so for the sake of this research, I narrowed that down to the top 20. I'll go into who those people are eventually. But I would say the one limitation of that is, or I guess two, is that if it is a musician or a record label executive, they are going to be inclined to either say themselves or somebody that they're promoting. If you're a label, why wouldn't you say that the person that is under your label is the most important artist of all time? And the other thing is that it is kind of just rock slash blues. And it is 9 years old, the list, 2009, whatever, 2011. But it is limited to 1950s up until 2011. So obviously that excludes a lot of music from before 1950, whatever. And different types of music, but I figured it would be okay to carry on with this because rock is one of the most influential and historically significant musical genres available. In terms of like world culture, it is the most significant and dominating power. I know rap, you might say rap is, and that probably is true today, but it hasn't withstood the test of time the way rock and blues have. To the point where we can definitely say this is the most successful artist of all time in that same sense. And so, I'm scrolling through my paper. Research, meaning, yeah, and so I think you said to skip the literature review, but pretty much my literature review is just saying, analyzing stuff in a very objective way is the purpose of meaning, the purpose of music. And essentially answering in some way that it bottom line, music kind of just makes our brains happy. It likes the rhythms and the chords and melodies. Our brains like structure, and it kind of gives that. And it's kind of, you can see the transition through periods of time where music kind of starts out in infancies, where people just kind of like it, and I think in my paper, there's something about a mom singing to her child and the child just liking it. So for a very basic understanding of what it is, that's kind of the answer, that it just kind of makes people happy. But it gets a lot more complicated, obviously, when you consider that people might go into music because it can make them a lot of money, and plenty of other reasons go along with that. And so after my literature review, so my research question is ultimately asking, why do artists create the music that they do, and artists being defined as successful artists in the way that I mentioned. And so I think also in my first draft, it said, what purpose does the way we listen assign meaning to that body of work? I don't think I answered that in my first draft. I think that might be a little too big, so I might cut that out. Anyways, so methods section, I kind of answered how I gathered that stuff. And then, so pretty much after compiling this list of the top, 25, not 20 artists, 25 artists, I pretty much just scoured the internet looking for interviews. Oddly enough, Rolling Stone had a lot of interviews that I used, just testament to their great interviews, I guess, and coverage of artists. And so pretty much, and so in the results I have, it goes from each artist from 1 to 25, starting with the Beatles, and then 25 is like Fats Dominoes, I think. And it includes 2 or 3 quotes from interviews and such that pretty much answer that, and then the link and whatever. So you'll see that in the final paper, obviously. But so once I gathered all this, I, just to make it easier for myself, and probably just visually for the paper, I listed out all the artists and gave like a short response, kind of simplified what their answer was. And so just for the sake of it, the Beatles was to entertain, is what it seems like. Bob Dylan was to speak for the people and make himself feel better. Elvis Presley kind of just seemed like he wanted to make hits. The Rolling Stones, they said it was to turn people on to blues, but we all know people like Mick Jagger that had some pretty lavish spendings. And I will say that that's probably another limitation of this paper, is that if you're interviewing somebody on why they make music, they know that that's a question that's going to be on a paper, on a magazine like Rolling Stone. So they're going to want to say something good. They're not going to say, well, I just do it for the money. They're going to want to say, oh, I want to inspire people and stuff like that. So that is a limitation, but that's really all you can go on if you're asking the artists themselves. And that is kind of at the basis of what my interest in this is in interviewing the artists themselves and asking why they do what they do. Anyways, I digress. Chuck Berry was to achieve freedom, primarily racial, just based on oppression and stuff like that in the time period that he is, and even now. Jimi Hendrix said expression freedom. James Brown said to make people happy, especially African Americans. Little Richard said make people happy and spread the love of God. Aretha Franklin said to serve women and to inspire them. Ray Charles said to the ability to play piano. I guess I won't go over all this because, you can read it. I guess the 2 ones that were kind of strange was like Buddy Holly. There was just nothing on him. I'm going to keep looking, I guess, but all there is on Buddy Holly seems to be his like childhood and where he grew up, and then the plane crash that he died in. There's no interviews or anything like that that specify anything about himself and musically, which I think is kind of sad that it's defined by that. So like I said, I'll skip the rest of the or what their answers were on the short, because time and all that. There was also another one, I guess it was just Buddy Holly. All right, whatever. And then I kind of just made little like answers and then tallied what was the most popular answers. And so it seemed like the most popular answers went along the lines of to inspire change, with 6, I think that is. 6 for expression, music being something that is creative freedom and expression. And then also success/entertainment had a lot too, which I thought was really interesting, that those were the main ones. And I think that's kind of what my initial answer was, or my hypothesis would be that it would be to express themselves, to entertain people, and then wealth kind of snuck in there. And so, yeah, I think you said to skip over the discussion a little bit. But yeah, that's pretty much what I found, and I think it's really interesting that the dynamic of an interview can be so dependent on that idea, or at least that is what it is to me. Every time that I was doing the research on it, finding that area of where the interview asks, like, so why did you spend 25 years of your life doing this kind of menial thing? If you think about it, it isn't like it's just like, I love music, and like it's just music. So to ask the question, why did this consume your life in creating it, and tour the country and the world, because it is pretty sacrificial. It's those pieces in interviews that I find really interesting, and I think compiling everything the way that I did, and compiling all these successful people that have such a mythology around them, compiling their answers onto one document is really valuable, at least for me, and I think it's something that I would want to read and I personally find really helpful. And I think when you go back and I think the value that you can also see is that if the answer was, let's say, to change people's minds or whatever, be revolutionary the way that Bob Marley said, you can then go on to ask, well, was he successful? And it's probably for another paper, but to go off of this paper and then ask, well, was the Beatles, the Beach Boys, Velvet Underground, Bob Marley, whatever it is, were they successful in their goal? Because if it is to be famous, I think if you're on this list, if you're in the top 25 of Rolling Stone, I think you've achieved that beyond anybody's expectations. But I think it gets a little trickier if you think, well, how do you define really what is changing people's lives? Or like how Aretha Franklin saying, I want to inspire women, you can probably go, oh, that I think she did, and I personally think she does, but it's kind of hard to prove, I think. But that, again, seems like another paper. But yeah, in conclusion, I thought that gathering all this information on people's famous artists' responses to why they make the music that they do is something that's valuable to us, because we can better understand them, and then if we can better understand them, we can understand our culture a lot better, because a lot of our culture is informed by these people and their ideas. And yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed my I didn't have any graphics, I just kind of talked for a while, so I hope that's okay.